Hey, everybody, it's Brett, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Behind the Stack, where today I am joined by writer Susan Rieger for her latest book, Like Mother, Like Mother. A little bit about Susan. She is a graduate of Columbia Law School. She's worked as a residential college dean at Yale and as an associate provost at Columbia. She's taught law to undergraduates at both schools and written frequently about the law for newspapers and magazines. She is the author of The Heirs and The Divorce Papers and lives in New York with her husband. So enjoy this episode of Behind the Stack. So I'm really thrilled to be sitting down today with Susan Rieger, whose new book, Like Mother, it's just so terrific. So thank you for being here. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for having me.
I'm so curious before we actually get into the book, because I know that you went to Columbia Law School, and I just would love to ask about how the transition to writing started for you.
Oh, I've had such an accidental career. I don't even know how to begin to explain it. I went to law school during when the civil rights movement was on and the women's rights movement was on, and um, I thought, I would do some kind of, public interest law. But the year I graduated, I got pregnant, had a baby, um, and I had to make money. My husband then was an academic, and we lived by the skin of our teeth. So I just took jobs as they came along, teaching or and I've always used my law, but I've never practiced. Um,
Mm.
I don't. I don't. I loved law school. I thought it was wonderful, and it's been very useful, and it's a lovely credential to wave about. But I've um, I've always used my law, and I started writing op-ed type pieces and legal ones on legal issues sometime in my 30s. And I did that through my 30s and 40s. And then I taught undergraduates law. And so it was part of my work experience too. Um, and then when I was at Yale, I was a dean at one of the residential colleges at Yale. And one of the projects I had done when I was teaching law at Brooklyn Law School, actually, was to prepare a moot court docket where you had to make up a whole case and facts so that the students could write briefs and argue it. It
Mm.
was so much fun doing it, and everyone else who had to do it hated it. And I thought, this might make a good novel sometime. And so after I had been divorced 10 years and I was at Yale and I had been there about 8 years and I had time on my hands, I just started writing my first novel, The Divorce Papers, and I just went from there. Now, I was very lucky. My daughter is a novelist, and she was incredibly helpful and encouraging, and she that was my original editor, so that was very good.
Oh, that's amazing. And here we are. All right. So for people who don't know the book, do you have an elevator pitch?
My elevator pitch. It's about a woman, a very hard driving workaholic woman who had a very rough childhood and is now editor in chief of a very important uh, Washington, D.C. newspaper. And she has three children, two of whom are cheerful. And the third one, the youngest one, wants her mother's attention. And her mother, because of her childhood, is completely incapable of being a mother. And so the story is basically focused on those two women. First, we take them from the beginning pretty much, um, and how they manage their relationship. My heroine dies on the first page, actually on the first
Mm.
sentence of the book, so this is not a spoiler. But I always say you have to bury your parents twice. The first time you put them in the ground, and the second time you say to yourself, they're never going to change. They're always who they
Wow.
are. I have to deal with what they were. And that's sort of a kind of stream through this. There's also a little bit of a mystery. My heroine, Lila, her mother was hospitalized when she was 2 years old and never came home again. Her father said she died. And the question was, nobody ever really was sure she had died or not. And so part of the story towards the end is whatever happened to this mother.
Yeah, I Lila is she is such an incredible character to me. I mean, she felt like a cross between Katharine Graham and uh, some part of Martha Stewart, which could be influenced by the fact that I just watched that documentary on CNN that they did on her.
Right.
But even her relationship with her daughter Alexis uh, bared similarities to her relationship with Grace. What was your inspiration for her? Because she's such an amazing character.
I suppose in some ways, I always say there would be no Lila Pereira without Roma Giovannitti, who is my mother.
Mm,
My mother is not like Lila in many ways, but she's also very tough, very funny, um, not very motherly. You know, I'm Italian and Jewish, and nobody was cozy or cuddly. Nobody was unkind, but and they loved me in their way. Um, and I always think my mother did the best she could um, for all of us. She always had our back. She always had her, but we weren't. We weren't. The children weren't that important in her life. She had to raise us, and if anything had happened to us, she would have been devastated. But her relationship with my father was always the most important relationship, and she did fine. She when she became an empty nester.
mm.
There was no narcissism involved with her. Our successes were our successes. They had nothing to do with her. She didn't get in the way.
It's funny because you say, you're a Jewish and Italian, and to me, my perception of is that both of those groups are very affectionate. And so it's interesting hearing you say that because I grew up as I was a WASP, and there was very there was very to none. It was also I was thinking about um talking about your mom and saying she did what she did, because you have a point when the two of the sisters are talking later, Ava and Stella, Grace's sisters, are talking about their upbringing, and they say, I'm paraphrasing here, but essentially, well, our parents never hit us, like we had a good upbringing. And it kind of made me laugh because I've had that same conversation with my siblings about my parents. And I wonder if part of it was just the time too. We'd always say, like, was never hit, never abused. Like, we came out of it and thought, they took care of us. They did. They put clothes on our back. They put food on the table, all of the necessary things that you did. We didn't sit around and talk about feelings and so on and so forth.
We didn't talk about feelings either. But my parents talked to us all the time, and my mother did treat us like people. And we talked politics, a lot of politics. Parents were very liberal,
Interesting.
and I'm considerably older than you. I grew up in the 50s and 60s, where you'd get up in the morning, get on your bike, and wouldn't come back until dinner. We had a great deal of independence too.
Um, do you find that your relationship with your daughter was very different than your relationship with your own mother?
Oh, I think so, but I think you may have to ask her. Um, I was just crazy about her, and I was because she grew up in New York City, which I didn't until she was 6, 7. Um, I was more protective. I mean, she wasn't allowed to go to the playground by herself and things like
Sure.
that. Um, I sup- I suppose I have some of my mom's coolness, but I think she knows I adored her. And interestingly enough, my mom adored her. They had one of those classic grandmother granddaughter relationships. My my mother thought Maggie was the bee's knees, the best ever.
That's so interesting too. And do you think now, like, because you have now grandchildren, and how do you find that relationship? Because I do always wonder with that, with being a grandparent, sometimes the relationship is so different than your own child.
Well,
Part of it is because you're not raising them day to day,
right,
I
yeah,
guess.
that is a liberty. I my grandsons are now 11 and 14, and they're a tween and a teenager, and they're they're talk to you, especially with their family, but they're very much involved in their own lives. They're very adorable. I was very close to them when they were growing up because they lived in Brooklyn, and I went at least
Mm.
once a week to see them. My granddaughter, on the other hand, who lived in Virginia and is now 18 and a freshman at Amherst, we've become very, very close as she's grown up. That has been become very important to me. Um, and what I say about my grandchildren is this: they're the easiest loves of my life.
Mm,
They're very easy to love. Um, Everybody else is much more difficult to love.
interesting. So Joe, who is Lila's husband, I love this relationship. And for our listeners and our viewers, it's all really about, so much of their relationship is about gender roles, because she takes on this kind of what would be considered a typical male view of things. She's the workaholic, and she relies on him so much to kind of take up the slack as a parent for these kids. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Joe has a good career. He's a very successful lawyer, first a government lawyer and then in private practice. But he was the primary parent, as one of the older sisters said, and it's very hard to tell them apart. Even I have difficulty telling them apart. She's When they talk about their youngest sister Grace, they say you had two dads. You had mom was one
Mm.
dad and dad was the other dad. But they called both their parents by their first names. Lila didn't want to be called mother, and so to be fair, they called their father Joe. But they were very close to Joe. And Joe realized there were things he didn't do. For instance, one of the problems is that the two older sisters, they're called the virtual twins, the Starbird.
Mm.
It's very hard to tell them apart. And they know it. They know that about themselves. Their friends can't sometimes tell them apart, though they're 13 months apart. And Joe says, I should have sent them to different schools. I should have made them wear different clothes. He knows the things he didn't do, and he said if Lila had been a real mother, she might have been able to tell me this, but she didn't know anything. And because of Lila's very hard growing up, um, she's she says to Joe when they are getting married, she says, nobody would have children with me. I'm not fit to be a mother. And her motto is, and was throughout, first, the Hippocratic Oath, first, do no harm.
And I recognize that. I mean, I recognize that role because my sister had that. My sister was a nurse anesthetist, and my brother-in-law always worked. But when they had kids, he just had more of the career that could make himself available to that. And I remember my mom always used to say, your sister could never have had that career without her husband. But I also love that Lila is just so upfront about it. There's no, she says, I understand this. It's not, she doesn't look at it as a failure. It's just a fact. I couldn't do this without you. And also I'm not cut out to do these certain things that traditionally what we now call a trad wife
Right.
would probably be that none of these women in this book would be
Oh,
considered
right.
a trad wife. They're the anti-trad wives.
Right.
I also made me wonder a little bit too, if in terms of these gender roles, how much changed with COVID in terms of everybody was home for a while. Everybody had to be kind of participatory in a way that they didn't have to before. And I always think about like a lot of men who were used to being out of the house all the time and suddenly who are home contributing and doing things they never did before. It just made me think of that as I was going through this.
Well, I suspect Lila went into the office during COVID.
Yeah.
We don't talk about this. She does get COVID early, but Lila would work everywhere, and everybody. And by the time COVID comes around, her daughters are all grown up and out of the house, and
Yeah.
um, so I
Had
think she and Joe would find separate spaces to work. But I suspect she went into the office.
had she lived, um, what do you think she would have wanted to be called by her grandchildren?
Oh, Lila. Everybody
Yeah.
called her Lila. She says that at one point. She says, except for a group of people whom she calls the Podsnaps, um, that everybody at the newspaper called her Lila, whether it was the porter or the janitor or the editor or a writer. Everyone called her Lila. She was very democratic that way. She said, if I call someone by their first name, they can call me by their first name.
I love that. Um, so one of the big themes of the book is this idea of like what I said the blessing or the curse of genetics, and how much we resemble our parents, what we embrace, and what we hope to kind of escape from. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I say it. I've thought about it. This that we can rebel against our parents, but we can't overthrow their influence, and we can't deny the genetics. I mean, as I get older, I look in the mirror and I see myself looking like both my mother and my grandmother, who look nothing alike. Um, and the temperaments, the temperaments. Grace really is like Lila in many ways, or as Lila says, Grace is very much like me, but I'm nothing like her. Um,
Mm,
Lila is a more ruthless version of Grace. Grace longs for something she doesn't have with her mother, but she's not really. She didn't think she was all that cut out to be a mother either. And though she does have a wonderful line, she said, "My sisters and I will never get over our mother." And she said, "And if I have children, they'll never get over me." She sees these
interesting.
things. She is temperamentally like her mother, though she looks like her father, which is interesting. Whereas the Starbirds, they have elements of their mother. There's no question. They look just like her. I mean, that family resemblance. Lila has a sister too who looks just like her too, and that's one of other Grace's grievances. She doesn't have a beautiful name like her sisters. She's tall, they're short. That she's dark haired, she's blonde, but she looks just like her father, whom she does love and knows is a great
Yeah.
human being. But we can't, you know, nature, nurture. I think certain things are just temperamentally there. You see it in your children. I have a temper, and I've always had a temper. My mother said when I was, 4, I was a foot stamper. There you go.
It is a strange thing to watch it in your own children, to recognize yourself or your behaviors in your children, or sometimes things that you wouldn't have even necessarily seen in yourself that suddenly somebody else calls out and says in your child, oh my, that's so much like you, or they're just like you, or it's a strange thing. I also think so many people, when they begin the parenting journey, start out saying, there's always that mantra of, well, I'm not going to do, my parents did this and I'm certainly not going to do this. And how quickly you fall into some of those same patterns, whether you want to or not.
Yes, I think you can't help yourself. They're in your brain. They never really die. They never die, and they don't change, and they're just in your brain. I always think that the Greek and Roman gods were really Zeus and Hera were really pretty much like your parents. When my daughter was very small, it reminded me when Marjorie Taylor Greene said that they, I suppose she means people like me, um, control the weather.
Right.
And I thought, well, I certainly wouldn't have sent a hurricane to Asheville, that's for sure. Anyway, but my daughter was about 3, and we were walking home on Riverside Drive, which is the windiest road in Manhattan, and we're Upper Manhattan on a hill too. And the wind is blowing, and it's cold. And she turns her sweet little face to me and says, "Mommy, stop the wind." I
Mm.
said, "Do you think I can do that?" And she said, "Yes." And that was the first time she realized my human limitations, I think.
Yeah.
After that, I was in, we're very powerful in their lives. One of the things they say about children is children start to lie when they're about 5 or 6 to test whether their parents really know everything and go everywhere, or invisibly following them around. And so if they get away with a lie, they have a sense of some autonomy, which is a nice way
Mm.
of looking at children's lives, which they all do at
So,
some point, right?
yes. And also what we learn about, and so much of that is what this book is about too, is learning about past and learning about our families, and just the stuff that you learn about your parents as you age. My mother, before she passed, she had dementia, but I used to really appreciate when it all started, because these memories would begin to surface that she'd confuse sometimes my brother with my father. And so she would be talking about things that I knew were parts of her life that she lived in that we never knew about. So I would try to get more information, whether she would look at my brother and say like, well, he's been staying out late. I don't like the people that he runs with. And of course, this wasn't my brother she was talking about. So I would always kind of prompt her and tell me more. Cause I was very
Yeah.
curious about this history and about their relationship and about things that, because, and this is something else I wanted to ask you in terms of what I said about, your relationship with your daughter. I find as a parent now, there's so much more openness between myself and my children about things we talk about. And it's also because of how we live now and because there is a news media that's in your pocket and information that's being disseminated. So I think there is a lot more information that gets shared, but nothing was told to us when we were little. My parents were my parents, and we kind of lived in our own bubble of kids, and they provided and did all those things, but we really didn't know. My parents fought occasionally, but not like many families could have fought. So I just knew what I knew, which was like, okay, I could watch TV Saturday morning, I go to school, I do the things I'm supposed to do.
My parents, I knew a lot about my mother's history because my grandfather was a labor leader, and he led the Lawrence strike of 1912, the Bread and
Oh
Roses
wow.
strike. And I always say that I'm just a real mutt. Everybody in my family has been intermarried, and nobody's been grand. But I do come from labor royalty, and so we knew a lot about him and her growing up. And but there were two stories my mother never told me that were until she was confronted with them. When my grandfather died, he had a large obituary in the New York Times, and we were very, very
Hmm.
proud. And as we get to the end, it says, he is survived by his son and two daughters. And he said, my mother and a woman named Vera. And we say, who the hell is Vera? I'm 11 years old or 12 years old, and I say, who is Vera? And she tells us then, my sister, I have an older sister and a younger sister, and she tells us, and she says, she was her half sister. Her father had been married before, and she said, she was always mean to us. I never liked her. Gone. And never talked about her, never met her. And children keep their parents' secrets. I mean, I told people my mother had a sister when I was grown up, a secret sister. But the second one, I had moved in with my first husband.
Hmm.
And I'm in my, early, am I, 24, 25 years old. And my grandmother says to me, this is the one married to the labor leader. She says, well, your grandfather and I were never married. And I said, no, I didn't know that. Now they would have gotten married if they got married about 1912, something like that. And she said, no, she said a lot of our friends did. They were left wing. They were anarchists and socialists. And so she thought it was perfectly normal. And so she wanted to get me a housewarming gift when I was moving in with Peter and I wasn't married to him. And she bought me 2 sets of sheets for our queen size bed. That was my grandmother. She was different. So I suppose that's one way of having a grandmother granddaughter relationship. I never said anything to my mother about this. But a few years later, my father mentions it for some reason over dinner. My mother has gone out of the room, and he mentions it to me, only to me, and says, uh, your grandparents, your mother's parents, were never married, and she found that embarrassing, somewhat humiliating, which you would never know from my mother. You can't imagine her being either of those things. Um, I think she did sort of, at a time, want middle class respectability, which she did not
Hmm.
grow up with. Um,
Hmm.
and so I'm now maybe almost 30, but I don't say anything to my mother. And then some years later, we're talking about family secrets with my sisters there too, who don't know. They know about Vera, but they don't know about my grandparents. And so I said, well, family secrets. My grandfather was alcoholic and things like that. And mom says, well, what kind of secrets? I said, well, like Nana and grandfather weren't married. And she says, this is so Lila like. Yes. End of subject. Never. That's the kind of thing. That's the kind of thing. That was it.
Period.
Period. Yes. I mean, somebody said, they say no is a complete sentence. Yes is a complete sentence.
Right.
And so I think in my two books, in my second book and this book, there are secrets, family secrets. And I think having those two secrets in my life, which are very different, I think every family has its secrets. And my parents didn't certainly confide in us unless we made them. So I'm only interested in families. That's all I'm interested in. As a writer, as a reader, I'm interested in a lot of things. But as a writer, I think families, everything, you can find everything in a family.
Well, there's a lot to mine. I want to talk really quickly about Ruth, who becomes Grace's roommate in college, and then they become best friends. And she's a very kind of integral part of the story. Can you talk a little bit about her? I loved her character. I also just thought it was such a unique perspective because she really does develop a relationship with the family in her own way with each of them. And so what made you bring her in and kind of made her give her the importance in terms of a character that you did?
um, I always think someone like Grace needs to be moderated. And in my first book, I have a character who's somewhat Grace-like, and she has a best friend who's always sort of moderating her. And I wanted to write a book about friendship. There's that famous line from Doris Lessing, which she used in The Golden Bowl. She said, I can't remember the names, Mary liked Joan. And the idea that the two women's friendships should be very important to a novel, I think is a good thing to have. I think friendships now are talked about much more, but there's also something so straightforward. And I was thinking about Ruth actually this morning, lovable about Ruth. Everyone loves Ruth. Um, and she has no sense of humor, which is unlike anybody else in the novel. Well, she's not. She recognizes humor. She just doesn't have one herself.
She's the straight man
She's the straight one, but
yeah.
and it's not that she's sincere. She can be very matter of fact, and I think her matter of factness appeals to Grace too. And what Grace provides for her is a kind of gingering. Grace presents a whole different world. Ruth is Southern and Baptist, and she has this roommate who comes from this very liberal Jewish family. And the thing about being Jewish in this book is I wanted to write a book where being Jewish was no different from a novel where people were Christians. It was just, they aren't religious, they're very secular, it's just who they are. It's not a major theme in the book. And that's what I wanted it to be. And so, Grace is exotic to Ruth, and Ruth is exotic to Grace. And as Grace says, they put us together as roommates because we're both tall. Though I don't know how they knew that, but one is 5'11" and the other is 6 feet. And so that's but Ruth is, I do love Ruth. Because she's the one who says, well, Joe does too. I think she's sort of Joe-like for Grace because, she's someone who loves her, but who speaks to her quite frankly and tells her to pull up her socks.
You were talking really quickly about the whole Jewish aspect of the book and how that's not what that you just wanted to be a part of it. And it's interesting because that was my next question for you. And I was going to preface it by saying Ruth would classify herself as a Christian, but only in the ways of kind of adhering to the tenets of treating people well. As I always say, personally, I feel like there's a big difference between, spirituality and religion. And there's a very wide chasm there based on my own experience. But, and Grace being Jewish, and they don't celebrate any of the holidays, but they asked this question and I wanted to ask you, what is your Jewish?
What is my Jewish?
Yes.
I think my father and my second husband is Jewish. My first husband was an English Catholic, more like my mother than like. And I say I married my mother the first time, my father the second. So my father and my husband are one part of being Jewish. They're sort of very lovely Jewish men, not at all religious, but they're very sweet-natured men. That's one day. So husbands and fathers are Jewish. Bagels and lox are Jewish. Um, a lot of my closest friends are Jewish or half Jewish or married to Jews, or I mean, it's New York City. I mean, in some way, everybody in New York City is Jewish. And I can't remember who said it. Lenny Bruce. Everyone in New York City is Jewish, and no one in Montana is Jewish, right? It's just, it's a cultural thing. We think of ourselves as Jewish. We know we're Jewish, but I'm also semi-exotic, being Italian too, um, and so it's just who I am. But if you ask me to say who I am, I would say first I'm a woman, then I'm a mother, then I'm a wife, and then grandmother somewhere in there. Then I'm a liberal Democrat. Then I'm Jewish. I don't. It's very much a part of me, but it doesn't figure much in my daily life. So
I'd probably put that kind of working with gay, so
right,
the
yeah,
same way.
right.
So yeah, it's just it's
It's just
part of the
yeah, that's
fabric
right.
of the
It's like
whole.
yes, and many gay couples have children, and you have children just the way straight couples had children for centuries,
Sure.
and it's just that's just normal life. It's just who you are.
I have two things because I want to be conscious of your time. One of my favorite lines in the book is said by a character, which is, "If I looked back, I couldn't go forward." Do you believe that for yourself?
I look back, but I don't know how useful it is. I mean, well, you have to know this. I spent 10 years in psychoanalysis from the age of
Mm,
35 to 45. And here and there I've had a brush up. But I had a good analysis. And I think having spent 10 years looking inside myself um, and crying a lot, I sort of say I'm finished with that. I did my interior life, and I have to just live with what's going on now. So later in life, I look back less. I might have memories, but I'm not at all in. But Lila, never looks back. She
yeah.
says the unexamined life is the only life worth living. And then there's a epigraph at the beginning. Don't look back. Someone may be gaining on you. Anyway, so that is a theme of the book. I look back, but I've given up. I've given up on that extreme introspection of a young person.
Okay, so moving off to two things. First of all, I want to say congratulations because I know the book has been optioned
Thank you.
by Universal Television for a series, which is really exciting. Now, are you going to be involved in that in any way?
Well, I am some kind of associate in the contract, some kind of associate producer somewhere. But
Produce.
I think I have to trust them, and so I think more or less it's going to be theirs. There's a wonderful book called The Wild Robot, and they made it into a movie, and my grandsons just loved it, and we all read it to them multiple times, and they made a movie which they all went to see, and they all loved the movie, and they said it was so different, and they didn't mind it. I think you mind it when they take a story you love and it isn't good. The movie, they think they've
Mm,
improved it
right.
or changed it, and it isn't good. But he said they love the movie and they love the book, and they're very different. So I'm willing to live with that.
That's great. It'll be fun for you, I think, in terms of casting to
Right,
watching how
to
these
see
people
what
come
they're doing.
together.
Right,
Yes.
yeah. I've
Yeah.
decided. Well, I decided Lila Scarlett Johansson. She's half Jewish. So,
Yes.
oh, I don't think you
Exactly.
need to be Jewish to play Lila because
Right. Off to wardrobe.
right.
My last question for you is tell me about, I was on your Instagram. Tell me about your felt art.
Oh, my felt art. Um, my felt art. I started it in 2016 when Trump was running against Hillary Clinton. And he
Mm,
said at the convention, only I can save you. only I.
Still saying
And
it.
my daughter then had a bookstore, a children's bookstore, and I've always liked to work with my hands. And she said, "You have to make something that we can sell at the store." So I made felt Christmas ornaments of animals,
Mm.
simple felt, but both sides. And I did a fox, I did elephants, I did a frog on a lily pad. That was very, very nice, and things like that. So so I had felt, I had a lot of felt, and so I don't know what made me do it, but I sat down at the table. I spent 12 hours doing it, and I made my first felt, which was Trump, and he was a caricature, and with that blonde hair going across his head, and holding his little hand up, saying "Only I," and
Mm.
that was my first one. And then so I felt, well, why don't I do someone I like? So I did one of Hillary Clinton. I'd now do birthday cards for the family.
Oh, nice.
I make felt birthday cards. I like working with my hands. I think working with your hands is very important. I think it makes you think. I think it's good. I think the brain works better. I'm really sorry children aren't learning how to write anymore, because I somehow think that using your hand affects how your brain works too. I'm not very
Yeah.
scientific. This is all. This is science.
No, I understand. And I was watching one of these, videos that someone posted the other day on Instagram about like if you were a child of the 80s, you remember these things and all that. And one of them was the chalkboard with the cursive letters above it in the smaller case and uppercase. And I thought, wow, it's so weird that all of that's lost. And like, my
No.
kids don't know any of that. It's such a strange thing. So, well, this was wonderful. Thank
Oh,
you so
oh,
much
it was
for sitting
wonderful
down with me
talking to
today.
you. So
I hopefully it wasn't. Hopefully it was an easy thing. I'm so excited for you. The book, everyone, again, is Like Mother, Like Mother. Buy it from your independent bookstore if you can, but just get it. It's really really wonderful. And again, thank you for being here, and I hope you have a lovely day.
thank you for having me. You too. Bye bye.